I think it is right to say that we all want to help in times of deep need. When a friend is hurting, we want to be a healer. But sometimes the tragedy seems too big, too far beyond our ability to help.
In the church circles, we talk about the wounded healer, and it's all great and fine until you're the one gasping for air.
And sometimes the tragedy is us, is in us and worked too deeply into our story. What then? What do we do then?
Maybe to put it in terms of our own healing is we have to come down to where we are. We have to come down to ourselves.
Tragedy, empathy, and withness. Today on Don't Hold Me to This.
Get my weight up in the winter just to flex on haters all summer. I be focused on my wins, but I can't forget my shortcomings. I ain't shed a tear since the last time I cut a roll.
The question before us, at least as we started down this path for this podcast, was a question of guilt.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, one of the things about the situation with my accident, well, there's a couple things that I think go into that. Is one, I often don't know how to distinguish guilt and shame, and I think a lot of things that I probably name as guilt inside of me are maybe better described as a shame. And I'm thinking about Brene Brown's definitions of the difference between the two, right? The guilt is that I've done something wrong, and shame is I am something wrong.
Right.
But the reason that so there's that part of it that I've been kind of mulling over in my mind and thinking about just how much of my self-understanding through a life in the church, and I don't want to claim the church owns the pride of building shame into people, but I know in my experience it certainly has. So whether it does that more than other livelihoods, lifestyles that grow up outside of that institution and those communities, I don't know, because that my only experience is a lifelong experience in the church, and shame was certainly fostered in that. And so, I've been thinking about that. And then the other thing that just when it comes down to writing about something that has to do with my accident, and especially thinking about it in terms of guilt, there's a unique relationship to guilt when the harm caused is an accident. It's not to, I'm not trying to elevate it or diminish it in any way. Either one, I think it sits within a person differently and maybe gnaws away at places because of it's formed in this moment of an accident, and yet it's consequential, and there's a culpability to it that is real. Those are the things that are in my mind, but I don't know that I don't know what to do with those threads of thoughts as I've just processed what I wanted to bring into the conversation today.
The thing that comes to my mind first as a question, and it's because I think it has come to my mind over and over again in situations that feel as accidental as the story that you wrote about. And you said it toward the end of your piece, that the events that led up to that moment would be totally different had any number of minuscule things gone differently. And in the tradition in which you and I both pastored and grew up, we have this way of articulating things that there's no such thing as accidents. we say that in a number of different ways. I think somebody trying to be like particularly empathetic and inject some hopefulness into a what feels like a hopeful situation will say something like everything happens for a reason. And I my cynicism wants to imagine all the terrible reasons for saying something like that. And then I also, there's a side of me that wants to say, like, I understand what they're trying to do. Their intention, if I can let their intentions be their intentions, I know that they're trying to help. So that's one thing. People will say those sorts of things, trying to offer some consolation. Mm-hmm. But then our tradition also will say things like God is exhaustively sovereign. Not a hair falls from your head. And it's not God's will. And I think, man, change one thing, change half a thing that led up to that moment. And none of this story has to play out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel that, but part of what I feel in that, even as I wrote it, there's there's an innumerable variables as well that could have made the situation that morning worse. And so when I say that, those innumerable things that could have gone differently to change the outcome, I intentionally didn't say for the better.
Sure.
Because I'm acutely aware of, I think because of this experience, I'm acutely aware of that reality. And so I think what is lost in the everything happens for a reason is that, right? It's a way of trying to shift the calculus to a positive, but the calculus could also very easily be shifted to a greater negative. And for for Thomas, it was the ultimate negative. It cost a life. And so I think those, I agree, well-intentioned offers of a, nothing bad happens or for no reason, or everything happens for a reason. I'm skeptical of that as well, not in some sort of esoteric statement, but I think that's all it is. It's all it ever can be, because even if that equation balances in the esoteric realm, in the God is sovereign over all realm up there somewhere, it doesn't change the reality of the equation on the ground.
Yeah.
And the reality of the equation on the ground is devastation and sorrow, loss of life. It impacted me and has changed me, and I carry guilt. I carry that sense of guilt and responsibility, and I carry shame, and my family's walked this journey with me. And then there's Thomas and his life and his family and his loved ones and his friends, and that's why I mentioned the butterfly effect. Is it 6 years away from the accident, I'm still bumping into things that I just, it's like it's the rippling out. It's the butterfly effect. I can see the hand of this accident on things that are happening all the time. So I think that's where whatever it looks like for God to work all things for good, I fundamentally reject the notion that means he causes all things and that they're good, right? And I don't know, and I'd have to look and think about this, but even as you quoted this, not a hair falls from your head, that your Father in heaven doesn't, I forget the exact word Jesus uses, but he doesn't say God pulls the hair out of your head.
Right.
It doesn't say that God is the cause of the hair falling from your head. That's not what he says. And so any kind of theological answer into grief that makes God the cause of harm, I don't know how you square that with who God is. I think that what our best efforts are trying to do is to understand how God is unmaking the broken things.
And I wonder if that's why, at least for me, and maybe this is true for you also, the nothing happens for a reason, that sort of phrase feels like it sort of skips across the surface, because the movement in God's effort to unmake all the broken things is a descent. It's a coming down into the broken things, becoming in every way just like the broken people. And the phrase, all things happen for a reason, feels like a resistance to descend. It feels like an invitation to ascend. Come on up out of the broken thing. And that's just not doable. We just can't do that. It's interesting that God's answer to the question, eventually, God's answer to the question, what are you going to do about this, is to come down into it, is to descend down into it. And maybe, I feel this, I feel all of a sudden conscious of the need to like relieve the burden of people who have used the phrase all things happen for a reason.
Right.
I don't. Please don't hear this as a criticism of you personally. But what I would invite, and I think I can make this invitation because I've been a recipient of this energy so many times in my life. Somebody coming down, descending down to where I am, and just feeling my sorrow with me. In some ways, eventually God's answer to the question of what are you going to do was to descend, was to come down. And if we can take our sounding off of that, like, what do I do when someone is hurting, when someone is in pain, when somebody's story has felt like it's unraveled in a way that you just can't knit back together? What do I do? And the trajectory of God's story and Jesus is we go down to them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's part of where, again, the thinking about an advocate
Yeah.
is we need somebody who will descend to be present with us in those places, in that suffering, but also to advocate for us, to represent us, to be things for us that we can't be for ourselves. And one of the things that was, just existentially, as I think back over the early days of, after the accident, and processing that, I remember praying for Thomas's family, that they would have a sense of justice from their side of it. I grieve, and I can't help but think about how terrible it must feel to have something so consequential impact your life, and you're just like, well, okay, well, what do we do with this, right? What do we make sense of this? And then I think about this, expanding it out from my particular story to people who their grief and their trauma is deep harm perpetrated against them, often by a loved one or whatever it is. And those people need to know that God descends to their grief, but that God also takes up their cause and advocates for them.
Hey friends, thanks genuinely for listening to this episode of Don't Hold Me to This. I'd love to ask you to help us by subscribing, and so I will. Like and subscribe on YouTube or Spotify, and also sign up for our written pieces at don'tholdmetothis.substack.com. It will all really help us out. I'm going to let this beautiful music play on for a few more moments, and then back to the conversation.
I do think I think what you said about that being a way of inviting you up instead of coming down to the place of sorrow, of grief, of injustice. I think that's right. I think that is by definition what makes those phrases trite, right? Is they're really an invitation for you to make the move from where you are, rather than what we do see in God's commitment to unmake the pains and sorrows of this world by descending into them and taking them up in his very person, his body.
It makes me wonder about the church's proclivity to leverage particularly guilt in this situation, shame more broadly, in order to bring about the kind of change that the church wants to see in people. Like what we see God doing in Jesus, which is where we come into contact with God most clearly, is coming down and advocating, descending and taking up the cause of. Yes. And what guilt and shame is doing is something else entirely. And yet it seems like it's been such a lever that the church intentionally, unintentionally uses to try to shape people into the kinds of people that the church discerns they ought to be. And I'm curious as to why. Like my initial response is that it's just so much easier to point out what somebody has done wrong. I mean, I know this as a dad, right? It's easier to point out what my kids have done wrong and to shame them for doing it than it is to get down on the floor with them and help clean up the mess. But surely there's more to it. Surely it's not just efficiency. Sure, because we know it. What's interesting is that the guilting and the shaming actually doesn't clean up the mess. The only time the mess gets cleaned up is when I get down on my knees with my kids and help.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I do think there's an efficiency to it. And you mentioned it in terms of the church and as a mechanism for this, but I mean, I can. It's very easy for me to see it in my own parenting, right?
Yeah,
which is oftentimes, in my worst places, if something is, my child is disrupting my world, whatever that might be. My natural, or my one of my tendencies, one of the broken tendencies in me is to try to find the quickest lever to get the outcome I want, which is no longer have my world disrupted, whatever that may be.
I just want to interrupt you really quickly because I think it's a super important point. My assumption in the analogy of my parenting was that whoever's leveraging guilt or shame is interested in the mess being cleaned up.
Right.
But I wonder if that's not true. Like, I wonder if the reason why guilt and shame are leveraged so quickly and with such a historical pedigree is because the desired outcome is not a kind of holistic restoration of everybody who's affected, but it's just a kind of speaking of peace. It's a kind of restoration of the non-disrupted experience that I was having, or that the institution was having, some form of peace that isn't actually peace.
I think that's what I experience in my own, as I've processed this through the lens of my parenting.
Yeah.
it's the epitome of selfishness, right? It's like, I want my world to go back to working the way I want world to work. And if you disrupt it, then I'm looking for the quickest lever back into. Now, my world may include, that there's not a loud kid running around or a mess on the floor. And so I think guilt and shame are ready-made levers. Just, I can apply this force and get the outcome I want with the least amount of emotional investment by me. I mean, this is what, we're not describing, this just dawned on me, all we're describing is family systems theory, right? We're just describing what happens when a system gets disrupted, and the family systems are designed to maintain homeostasis. That's and when people don't play the part that we expect them to play, or they disrupt that in some way, then the whole system comes into play to get back to homeostasis, right?
Yeah, and I think that the heaviness of it, I think both in parenting and in institutional life, is that the person who's got their hand on the guilt lever or the shame lever pulls that lever in terms of, in the case of the church, in religious terms. And the parent pulls that lever in terms of their parental role and their authority terms. And so it feels really compelling. Like, you are the parent, you are the leader, you are the elder, you are the pastor. You did make this decision, and so it must be right. It says it, and you even quoted a Bible verse, so it must be true. And it's just a sophisticated mask for, I think, at the end of the day, a refusal to get down on our knees together and clean up this mess together. I talked to my dad today, who religiously listens, who reads all the things we put out, and religiously listens to and watches all of our conversations. He's our biggest fan. So I called him today, and he wanted to talk about the piece that you wrote. What he said was he really loved it and appreciated it. And what he said was, if his 70 some odd years of life has taught him anything, is that when you hugged your attorney for all the reasons you needed that hug, my dad said, your attorney very likely needed that hug too. You and I were texting this morning, and I asked you how you felt, and you said it felt presumptuous to send that story out into the world. And what's interesting is those two conversations really came against each other in that moment, when my dad told me that he knew without a doubt that your attorney needed the hug as much as you needed it. The story in some way generated a sense in your own appraisal of yourself that you didn't have anything to offer. Like, who am I to write about this, to talk about this? And my dad didn't know that you said that when he talked about your attorney needing the hug. It's so surprising that in a moment when I perceive myself as most deeply needy, I might somehow be exactly what somebody else is needing.
Yeah. I mean, I love the idea of it. Right? Yeah, I love the idea of it. I don't love it for myself. I think that's maybe the struggle we all struggle. Is we love the idea of need, we love the idea of vulnerability, even the idea of everything happens for a reason, right? But when you're in the you're like, I'd take a good thing happening for a reason, right? Why does nobody ever say that when, when the good thing, why do we why do we use that to console ourselves? I think this is part of, I love that your dad said that, and it really, I love that idea. And I think without speaking for somebody else, I think that totally makes sense. That's something my attorney also needed. And I know, because I know what he deals with as a part of his vocation. And two, I know what he's dealt with because his life has its own traumas and griefs. And I guess what I would say to that is I will accept that and try to allow that to be something that is a gift in the midst of a really, painful moment. I mean, I've said this before. I don't, we all in the church circles, we talk about the wounded healer, and it's all great and fine until you're the one gasping for air, and you're like, I don't, this is not what I this is not what I want.
I think that's right. And I think that the challenge for all of us, I mean, I think deep down in all of our humanity, we want to be positive forces. We want to be a healer. And the challenge is that the only way to do that is to do that through one's own wounding. None of us have the prerogative to heal without coming into contact with our own need for healing and our own woundedness and our own process of healing.
Yeah.
Which is why I think the descent is so vital. Maybe to put it in terms of our own healing is we have to come down to where we are. We have to come down to ourselves.
Right.
Before we can come down to someone else.
That's right. And yeah. So I was just thinking I think that's right. We have to come down to where we are. And that's what I don't like about it.
Yeah.
And that's what the piece is, part of the emphasis of the piece is that confrontation. It was an experience of having your bubble burst in kind of the worst possible way, right? It's like, oh crap. As I read them, I wonder how they land to other readers, but it's why I use the spinach between your teeth and because those are so basic human frailties, right? Mistakes, and we all have them, and we all maybe we don't all hate them. I hate them. Those things. I don't want to be that person, right? I work really hard not to be. And so this situation just, turned all that up to 11, and there was no escaping it. There was no escaping me.
I look at the people who, I hate those things too, those sort of like accidental situations that are out of my control and also that I don't know are happening. The toilet paper stuck to your foot, the spinach in your teeth is like, everybody knows except me. I'm the one who's the butt of the joke, and I don't even know we're telling a joke. I have this sort of strange, off the charts envy for the person who can look at their friend sitting at a dinner table, smile the toothiest grin, and go, do I have anything in my teeth? I'm like, you can't do that, because then we'll all see it and we'll all know. That's a thing that you got to handle on your own in secret. And I'm like, man, you've got the courage to just to say, like, I probably do have spinach in my teeth. Do I? Can you check and see? And I'll take it out. Like, oh, I wish I had that kind of courage. And I wish I had that kind of courage, both for that situation and for all the metaphorical situations that are just like that.
Right. And that's where I think where guilt, the language of guilt really is more about shame. But I don't know, even just that, if we're talking about just the frailty of our humanity, or at least post fall, because I do believe the biblical story, I hold that as a story of humanity, that we were made for something else, something different than that. And so those are all markers of something broken in the story, and they're painful. One of my friends, they had, I forget, I don't know what they call them in their mission statement of their church, these little taglines. And one of them was, we share our poverty. And I love it because it's a bit harsh, like it's a bit hard to know how to accept that. It's very, very, very biblical. And I think if a community could actually build an identity around that, at least as a part of their identity, is that this is who we are. We are a people who share our poverty. Maybe that alleviates the notion that I have to be heroic. And that heroic sense of self that gets, that I've been disabused of. Maybe a community could do that in a way that was more tender and kind, and also could see the heroism in sharing your poverty, right? And actually being this kind of person and being this kind of community together. So I love that. I love that idea that he needed that hug too. That's gonna sit with me.
Good. My dad will be pleased. He wanted me to be sure to tell you.
Yeah.
Don't Hold Me to This podcast is a production of Don't Hold Me to This. Music this week is by Humans Win, CJ Harris, and QHEF777. Like the podcast, subscribe, and follow on whatever platform you are on. You can find out more, do some more reading, get in touch, and subscribe to our writings at don'tholdmetothis.substack.com, no apostrophe.